Well, I want to thank you all for joining us tonight. It was very exciting to have so many responses. And I just want to let you know, as you can see on the board on the screen there, that your local sustainability group, the Upper Charles Climate Action, is sponsoring the evening tonight. And if you'd like to check us out, you could Google us, the Upper Charles Climate Action. And we also have a Facebook page, and there's a URL address on the last slide tonight. So a couple of housekeeping things. We want everybody to mute themselves unless you're speaking at the end. But as far as questions are concerned, we'd love for you to put them in the chat, because I'm sure we'll have duplicate questions. And then one of us will get to Grisha about questions, but he will have some time after each section for some questions. What else? Okay, just a little brief introduction about how I met Grisha. I drove by this guy bending over a corner lot in a big hayfield on my street. And I finally stopped one day and I was like, what are you doing? And he told me he was planting garlic. So we got to chat, and I wanted to buy some, of course, but he wasn't selling it at the time. But anyways, over time, I enticed him to join our group, the Upper Charles. And then once he showed up at a meeting, we definitely honed in on his skills, and we got him tonight because I wanted to do something for Earth Day this month. So this is my gift to you people about Earth Day, I guess.
Thanks, Debbie. I appreciate that.
Thank you. Are you kidding? So Grisha graduated from UMass College of Natural Resources and the Environment in 2008, and he moved to Sherborn about 6 years ago and started his own little farm, Shady Grove Farm, and he does have a website, shadygrovefarm.com. If you want to, he said he'd be willing to take questions. Are you sure? I asked him if he was sure he wanted to be inundated by people just randomly sending emails.
It's a topic I'm happy to discuss.
Yes, he's very passionate about growing. That's the one thing he's passionate about local agriculture and composting. So I guess I'll turn it over to Grisha now, and thank you all again for coming, and I hope you enjoy it.
Yeah, thanks Debbie. I'm definitely honored to be, to have been invited and to be talking about compost, and I wanted to thank the Upper Charles Climate Action Group for hosting this. I can't say that I know everything about composting, but I'm definitely looking forward to sharing with you all what I do know. And I'm also really excited that so many people are interested in composting, and that this webinar got sold out and people want to hear more. So I think that's great. It's great for our community, and it's also great for the planet. So it's all really exciting stuff. What I was going to do is first provide an overview on what compost is and how it works and so forth. Then I can take a few questions, and then secondly, I'll go through a few different methods and examples of how all of us can really easily do composting at home. And then at the end, I'll discuss the final outcome, what you'll be left with and how to use it, and how to use it properly. That's both good for plants and also good, for the environment. And then happy to, take as many questions as there are. So I guess to start, what is compost and what is composting? Composting is essentially just the natural decomposition of organic materials. And in this case, organic materials are things that were at one point alive. So that's a very wide range. It could be an old leather glove that you found in the back of your closet, or it could be some vegetable peels that you got from dinner, right? Everything that was once alive will eventually decompose. And so how I think about composting is essentially how you would have a dairy farmer, for example, think about, raising cows and making milk. So with composting, you're not raising a cow, you're raising bacteria and you're raising microbes. And these are the, microscopic animals that break things down and create compost. So just like a cow, compost needs air, and specifically it needs oxygen to breathe, just like an animal. And it needs water. It needs water to drink, just like a cow would, and it needs food. So food it's an interesting part of it because if you look at compost, you may have heard of what's called a carbon to nitrogen ratio. So essentially, the mix of food that you feed your composting, I call them mini composting cows, these microbes and these organisms. The ratio of food that you feed them is important in speeding up the compost process and making it more efficient. So you got the air, you got the water, you got the food, and you have, comfortable conditions. So just like a cow, you don't want it to be, super hot, and you also don't want it to be freezing cold because that won't be comfortable for the cow. And so, when you're done with dinner and you're bringing out your scraps, I think of it as I'm going to feed my compost microbes, and I want to make sure they have enough food. I want to make sure they're breathing, and I want to make sure that they're comfortable, right? So they have good temperature. So just going back to that carbon to nitrogen ratio, that's very important. So you want that ratio to be roughly 30 to 1. So 30 to 1 is you want 30 parts browns, and browns are things that are sort of dry and dead and woody. So it could be leaves from fall cleanup. It could be napkins, also from dinner, paper napkins. It could be wood chips. It could be branches, things like that. And then so you want 30 parts of that, and then you want 1 part of nitrogen. And nitrogen are called greens. So that could be grass clippings from your lawn. It could be vegetable peels from your dinner. It could be green leaves from just some pruning in your garden. It could be coffee grounds from your morning coffee. It could be manure from the your horse or chickens if you're lucky to have some animals at home. And then when you put all that together, you have these microbes and organisms that just come from the ground, and they feed on this compost food, this carbon to nitrogen ratio of food. And then as an end product, they have a number of outcomes. You have the water, just like a cow would pee out in the field. You have heat, just like a cow would have body heat when it's alive. And then you have CO2, because microbes breathe just like humans or like cows. And then you also have the humus, which is the actual material that the microbes produce as a waste. And that's what compost ends up being. Now, you may be asking yourself, wait a second, he mentioned CO2. And I know CO2, it's not a good thing to be producing. So that's an interesting point. And I don't want to get too deep into the chemistry of global warming, but this is a pretty interesting point. When carbon, right, one of the 2 food sources, breaks down, it can give off either methane gas, or it can give off carbon dioxide. And when you're composting at home, or if you buy compost, when it's produced with oxygen, it produces CO2. And when it's produced, when the carbon or the nitrogen breaks down in a landfill, it produces methane gas. And there's a very big difference between methane and CO2 when it comes to global warming and the greenhouse effect. So CO2 absorbs 1 unit of heat, and methane absorbs 30 units of heat. So if you have two different decompositions, one is composting and one is a landfill, then the landfill will produce 30 more units of heat than compost. So even though compost does produce some CO2, it's 30 times better, for our planet than if you were to just throw those leftovers into the trash. So composting is it's a nice way to reduce, the greenhouse effect and global warming by producing CO2 during the decomposition process instead of methane. So that's kind of how it works. And here, I guess I can take a little break and ask, answer any questions people might have on just kind of how compost works and the ins and outs of it.
How do you know how much water to add?
So compost should be, if you were to grab a handful of it and squeeze, you should get, 1 to 2 to 3 drops of water. So it should be kind of moist, sort of like a sponge, not soaking wet, but not bone dry either, sort of in between. Good question. Let's see, what was the ratio of green to brown? So the ratio, it's more brown to green. So you want, for example, 30 pounds of, leaves, dry leaves, and 1 pound of coffee grinds or 1 pound of kitchen scraps. Yeah.
So what happens if you don't begin to have enough browns to make up for your kitchen scraps? Should we really be using black earth or some professional composting?
Yeah,
because we couldn't come. I mean, in a little tiny backyard, we can't come close to that, really.
Well, you can come close to the ratio. You can have, a cup of, waste from your kitchen and 30 cups of, leaves, for example, or napkins.
Yes, although it's scarcely worth it in terms of processing the waste from my kitchen if I could only put like a tiny little bit of it into my compost pile.
Yeah, well, you'd be surprised. It breaks down pretty fast. And it doesn't have to be perfect, it'll still break down. What makes
what I have noticed, I've been doing this for several years with way more greens than you're describing. And I think what's happening is that the trees around are simply eating the compost, which is a way of sequestering the carbon. So it's okay, but it's not, it's just, I guess I'm not doing anybody any harm by it, but I'm just noticing that it's far from ideal, apparently.
Yeah, and the thing is, it doesn't have to be ideal, If you're keeping it out of the landfill and you're feeding the trees in your yard, that's perfect. That's what you're looking for.
So a little more on the same subject. What do you get if you don't have the right ratio? Because I'm in the same situation as Dawn.
Well, it depends if it's the right ratio of the food or the air or the water. I'm saying
if there's a lot more food scraps than anything else.
Yeah, it'll just decompose, a little slower. It may smell a little bit. So, it won't be perfect, but it'll still decompose, just slower mostly.
Okay.
So Debbie, your question about heat, what makes the heat in the compost pile? And that is, if you could picture packing, a room full of cows, right? And they're all going to be producing body heat. So these microbes and the organisms, they're just like, you can think of them just like an animal that's living and breathing and that's producing heat. So that's kind of how, where the heat comes from. If I use pine litter for my cat and I'm not going to put the compost on my food garden, is it appropriate to put that in my brown? From what I understand, anything to do with cats, they have certain types of bacteria that I would keep out of your compost. Anything to do with cats or dogs. So yeah, shredded paper is a great source of browns. Absolutely, paper, napkins, even those sort of recyclable food containers that some restaurants have. Those are great. we have 10 chickens. What about chicken manure or chicken shavings? That's excellent ingredient for compost. Any type of manure is excellent. Good question, Alicia. So Debbie, should I move on to the next section, or are there any other questions that people have?
I actually have a question, if that's okay.
Yeah, of course.
I've been doing composting for a few years all wrong, because I've been putting it into a container, I make 2 pails of vegetable clippings a week and putting that in and not doing browns. It took forever to break down, and I'm just now using it in the garden. The eggshells haven't broken down, but I'm just using it anyway. But I'm going to now do the 30-to-1 ratio. But what I have created so far, is it okay to use it? It's
absolutely. You know,
eggshells.
just going back to that earlier question, you know, it'll be a much slower process if the ratio of the ingredients are off. And eggshells are kind of particular just because how hard they are. They take a long time to decompose, but they're really, there's no harm in them. So even if you took your eggshells and crumpled them up and put them right in your garden, you wouldn't see any negative effects. So yeah, just add, you know, to your pile the way it is, add some wood chips or some dry leaves or some napkins, and
I will.
It'll start to go in the right direction.
I had no idea it was 30-to-1.
Yeah, it's
I've been doing the reverse probably.
Yeah, that's okay. That's all right. Now you've got a good starting point.
Years to make it.
Yeah, that's fine.
When you do it right, how quickly will it go?
I would say, you know, on a smaller scale like this in the backyard, you know, maybe 6 months.
Okay.
Maybe less. It depends. You know, it depends on how much oxygen. Usually oxygen is a limiting factor for people that do it in their backyard. Okay. So Utah, and I would, you know, your question about natural cleaners, I'm sort of, you know, on the fence about that. I think anything like that, you know, if the question is, would you spray it on your plants or put it in your garden? I'd probably say no, you know. But if you're just kind of scattering it somewhere where you're not going to be eating the end results, then maybe it's okay, because you just never really know what's in those cleaners. Joel, pine needles are great ingredient for compost. So that's one of the myths out there, is that, you know, pine needles can somehow, you know, negatively affect compost, and that's not true. You can definitely use pine needles.
They're not too acidy? I always thought that they would be.
No, you know, by the time the compost process is finished, it's actually a neutral pH. So it'll be a pH of 7, you know, if you're composting.
Are pine needles considered green or brown?
I'm sorry, say that again?
Are pine needles considered green or brown?
It depends if they're, you know, alive or if they're dead. Okay. You know, so I mean, they're considered green for a short amount of time, I would say, and then they turn brown. Pizza boxes can definitely be used. I would just be careful with, you know, like old meat and stuff if you have a meat pizza.
Or oil. I heard that if you have leftover oil on your salad or something, for vinegar and oil, you shouldn't be using that in your compost. Yeah,
I would avoid oil, especially, well, I think from your salad is okay, but if you're frying it, then I would avoid it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
I just want to let everybody know, if you need leaves, I have tons. 97 Hollow Street, Sherborn.
Yeah, I think we all have a few leaves to spare around these parts.
True.
So let me move on to you know, a couple different ways that all of us can do this composting process at home. So I forget who's managing the slides, but maybe we can just move on to the second slide so people can see if you know, the illustration. So these pictures are not ideal, but I hope you can sort of see the gist of it. And the first one I wanted to talk about, and I'm going to go in order of magnitude, is worm composting. So these are, the worms that you have, crawling under the ground. And this is a really cool option, because for someone who, lives, in an apartment or a condo, or maybe just doesn't have, good access to a yard or just the outdoors, this is a great way to, compost your waste and do it without needing a lot of space. You can either buy one of these worm bins on Amazon, or you can make one yourself. Essentially how they work is there's different levels with holes in them, and you go to the bottom level and you lay down this layer initially of the carbon sources, and then you put down your worms. Either red wigglers or red worms are known to be good composting worms. And then you start adding your nitrogen sources, so your scraps from your kitchen, essentially. And then the worms, they eat it, and then they leave behind the humus, and then they crawl up to the next bin. So you take the bottom bin, you use the compost, and then you put it on top of the stack of bins. So you just have this constant rotation of worms breaking down the material and producing these small batches. So if you live in an apartment, you can compost all of your kitchen waste, and then you can use it in your flower pots or what have you. So that's the smallest scale, easiest to do indoors type of composting. And interesting fact about worms is that they typically double in population in about 60 days. So once you get a nice colony established, you can have a really good, compost digester in a month or two. So the next style, and this is an outdoor style, but it's a very contained style. It's a tumbler, compost tumbler. And what I like about the tumbler is that, for me, at least personally, we have a dog and we have a cat. And so sometimes, you don't necessarily want, various waste to be accessible to your pets. So a tumbler is like it's a barrel, horizontal barrel that spins. And the one in the picture is interesting because it's got two sections. So you have one section, and you have the same conditions where you have you put some water in there, and you put the carbon to nitrogen ratio of food in there, and then as you spin it, the reason why it's kind of a spinning barrel is so that the air can get to all of the parts of the compost. And you could use even sort of a homemade old trash bucket or a trash can. You could put some holes into it, and then add the stuff, and then just tumble it around once every couple days so that it has enough oxygen to break down. And it's also pretty easy. Your kids can go out there and just put the scraps in, give it a turn, and it's sort of fun. So this one with the two sections, it allows you to get a nice batch going, and then you stop adding to it so it finishes, and then you get the second section going so that you have again a rotation. So you're constantly able to divert waste from the landfills and constantly be able to produce some compost for you to use in your garden. And it's black for a reason, because it attracts more heat, and the more heat you have, the quicker things break down. So if you can, you have one of these tumblers in a sunny spot in your yard, maybe right in the middle of your garden, so that you bring stuff out there, and then when you finish the compost, you spread it right on your plants. So it works pretty well. So the next one in terms of size is a bin system, and some of you may have seen these, or you may use these in people's backyards. And essentially, it's a more open setup, but it also allows you to process some more volume. And so you build it up in the first bin. So it's like a section, and the picture I have is of pallets, which are a common building material for these systems, but you can use logs or boards or whatever you have laying around. And the idea here is you build up a pile, and then after it's built, you move it to the next section, after, let's say, a month or two, and then you start the pile again. And then after some more, you move the first pile to the second pile, you move the second pile to the third pile. And at this point, as it's breaking down, compost typically reduces in volume by half by the time that it's done breaking down. So, you're able to process a good amount of material. And, if let's say you do each bin for a month, and if you turn it enough to give it air and give it some water to make sure it's not dry, after a few months, you'll have some finished compost, especially if you're doing it during the summer. And then the third pile is, the fourth picture is how commercial companies produce compost. Is what they'll do is they'll make windrows, which are just long, tall piles, and they'll get the mix, exactly how they want it to be between the carbon and the nitrogen. And then what they'll do is they'll mechanically turn it, typically with a tractor or some sort of equipment to add the oxygen. And then they'll also monitor the moisture to make sure that the microbes and the organisms have enough, air to breathe and water to drink. And this is a, pretty technical process, and they try to have their steps uniform each time they do it. And this particular setup in the picture is maybe hard to see, but there's a, not a propeller, but like a, like a huge drill, and it turns the compost and it mists water into the compost mixture as it goes, so that, it's all full of oxygen and full of the right amount of water every couple of days. So it's a very intensive process, and so there's a lot of organisms in there, and they produce a lot of heat. So for a large commercial pile, it's very common for the temperature to heat up to 130 to 140 degrees. So, and one of the benefits of that high temperature is that if you have, some plants in there that maybe are not desirable, like weeds, for example, those high temperatures kill weeds after a couple of days of that temperature. And they also kill any sort of, disease or mold or anything like that. So those are, all the different ways that, composting can be done. And, with the exception of the windrow composting, all of us can very easily do some sort of composting, whether it's using worms, in a small space, to using a tumbler, in a small garden, or even the 3-bin system if you're, a little bit more into the whole process.
Grisha, we have a question about, is the compost from a tumbler used directly, or is it too strong for plants?
The compost from the tumbler, assuming that it's finished, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Assuming the compost is finished, it is safe to use directly from the tumbler. So I guess I might as well answer that question a little bit more fully. So finished compost should be sort of dark brown and, a little bit moist. And just looking at that other picture in that in the slide, the Radish test. This is a picture that I took myself of the test that I did at home. So it's not a great picture, but what you can see there is it's an egg crate, and what you can see there is on one side there's a bunch of growth, right, and then the other side there's nothing. And the way it works is radish seeds are known to germinate very quickly and fairly easily. So what you do is you get a pot and of your compost, and you plant 4 radish seeds in the pot. You water it, and if at least 3 of them come up, then you've got good finished compost. In my case, I did a bunch of cells, and it was mostly 4 for 4. So that's a really easy test. It doesn't require any lab work, and anyone can do that test at home. So you tumble your compost for a while. When you think it's close, it's dark and uniform, you can do a test that takes maybe 3 or 4 days, and if you can see the radishes come up, then your compost is ready.
Grisha, I have a question. Can you maintain the tumbler? Does that keep composting even during the winter and real cold weather?
Yeah, I would say as long as it's in the sun, it's going to heat up enough every day. If it's in a shady spot and it's super cold, then it decreases your chances of the compost working as quickly. But you'd be surprised, these little organisms, they just keep going, even in the winter. As your piles get bigger, they regularly stay over 100 degrees even in the winter if you have the ratio right. So, but yeah, keeping it in the sun, those barrels, that goes a long way. So I guess we can open up here for just some questions about the different types of compost systems. If anyone has any questions.
Can I just ask, there is another style of compost bin that sits on the ground and has a door on the bottom.
Yeah.
It's black and it fits together.
Yeah.
Are those any good? I know that you somehow have to stir it.
I think those are fine. The way they work is, you have to add the material from the top, and it's supposed to sort of decompose. And by the time the material gets down to the bottom, you have the same rotation. And at the bottom, it should be more finished, and you scoop it out and you use it. And so, they have holes in the sides, so air should be flowing through. But the tricky part with those systems is that it's a little bit harder to mix up the compost. So essentially, when those microbes, they run out of air, they kind of slow down or they die off. So what you can do with one of those is, if you have a drill with one of those long augers, you can just go through that pile every couple of days with a couple cranks of the drill, and that'll introduce some air back into the pile.
Okay.
I think those are great, and it's sort of like a tumbler where it's smaller and it's closed off from animals, and they work. Yeah. How do I get the amount of oxygen right? So I think the short answer is every couple of days you should give the pile some oxygen. If you've got the tumbler, then it just as easy as spinning the tumbler every couple of days. And if you've got the 3-bin system, for example, then every couple of days you would want to go out there with like a pitchfork or something, or a shovel, and just kind of rough it up and turn it over. And that's a good way to do it. And again, every couple of days, every week. It doesn't have to be perfect, as long as you're doing it once in a while. Can we add this type of compost to all parts of the garden any time of year? I live in Southern California, warm climate, and even if we don't know the chemical makeup exactly. Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, if your plants are growing, or if your plants are dormant, then they could certainly use the compost. So it's definitely a full year, everyday type of process. That's a good question. I wish I was in Southern California right now.
I have a question.
Yeah.
The town of Holliston sells at the town hall a cone one. It's like, it's a bin and it has a cone on top. How does that one work?
That one works similar to what Debbie was talking about. So you kind of pack it with all the materials, and then you put the cone on top. And the way the cone works is it covers it, but the water is able to bead down, the edges of the cone into the the bucket. And then again, you'd have to, and it kind of goes down as the compost decomposes. And so you have to, get in there with a fork or something like that to fluff it up once every while to make sure that, those microbes and organisms have enough oxygen to breathe and have enough water. So there's, many different ways to compost it, but I think
I
the
just
point
stopped
is,
my video.
I think the point is just making sure that you're, keeping all this type of waste out of the dump, and keeping it, composting with oxygen somewhere in your yard, or, through a composting company.
I do have one other question, going back to the leaves. Is it okay to use oak leaves, or are they too acidy and you should try to stick with maple leaves, or if it doesn't matter? Thank you.
Yeah, no, the type of leaves don't matter, but again, just keeping in mind, if they are green leaves, then you would categorize them as sort of the nitrogen, the 1 in the 30-to-1 ratio. And if they're brown and dead leaves, then you would categorize them as carbon, so the 30 in the 30-to-1 ratio. But again, it doesn't have to be perfect, and you can use essentially every type of leaf. And leaves are great because, they're very, like, if you take a dead leaf in your hand and you break it, it crumbles like dust. So leaves are a great ingredient because they break down quickly, and they're kind of easy to process. So especially if they're shredded leaves or broken leaves, the more surface area that the materials have, the quicker and easier the organisms and the microbes can digest them and turn them into compost.
Thank you very much.
Sure. Our meat leftovers, mussels, shells, okay to add? Absolutely. Just the problem logistically is that, it can be a little bit messy if some sort of animal gets in, but again, anything that was once alive, animals or bones or meat, very, very compostable. It's a little bit of a challenge to do it at home, just because, it can attract rodents or coyotes, but it's certainly compostable. And if you've been to the store and you've seen, what is it, Coast of Maine, it's a popular compost you can buy at like Sweet Meadow or another local garden place. They use mostly lobster shells.
Mhm.
So they get the ratio right to break down lobster shells, which are pretty hard to break down. What's the next question? Does orange, lemon, grapefruit peel count as greens? Absolutely. Yep. You can use any sort of citrusy peel, and they'll break down nicely over time. Sometimes they'll mold at first, but they'll break down nicely eventually. So, a couple interesting things that I wanted to highlight is each person, on average in the US, wastes about 1 pound of food per day. So that adds up to, I think about 100 million tons per year. So if each one of us was able to compost, even a handful of material each day, that would make a huge impact. And when food waste goes to the landfill, again, it produces methane, which is awful for for our air and the environment. But it also ends the food cycle of that waste. So if you're composting, you're basically having a rotation of the waste turning into compost, and then you feed the compost to the plant. It turns into food again, and it's a cycle that's very sustainable. When you turn that food waste in a landfill into methane gas, it's very hard to sequester methane. So it makes a big difference, if you compost. And again, going back to that difference, methane makes the earth 30 times hotter than CO2. And to give you a point of reference, right now in the US, about 6% of food waste is currently composted, which is not not a lot. I think we could do better. So those are a couple interesting facts, that you can think about in the big picture level. Could compost be used as fertilizer for rhododendrons? Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, compost, like, again, I think I mentioned earlier to someone else, it has a neutral pH. So it doesn't really, you don't have to have discretion over what you use, what sort of plants you use the compost for in terms of fertilizer. It's good for any plant. And it's also, fairly mild. So it's not like you're going to burn your plant with too much fertilizer if you're using compost. It breaks down slowly, and it's a very even fertilizer. And by even, I mean it's even between the three main fertilizer, attributes, which are nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium.
That was my question, Grisha, and I wanted to find out, is it a problem if your compost is not fully cured? If you added that to the plants, I mean, to your bushes, the rhododendrons and lilacs, is that an issue if, let's say, the pH is not quite right?
I would say no. I think if it's composted, let's say a few months, and it's not 100% perfect, it'll just keep decomposing, in your garden or in your flower bed. It'll just happen a bit slower,
Yeah.
Basically, things are going to decompose one way or another, without question. But if you're composting them, either worm bin or the 3-bin system or the tumbler, it makes the process more efficient and quicker, and it gets you to the finished compost faster. So, I wouldn't recommend just dumping all of your, food waste on your garden, but if you give it some time to compost and you put it in a little bit early, that's not going to do any harm. Barbara, regarding fireplace ash is very high in carbon, because it's kind of like wood chips, but even more concentrated. So it's a great source of carbon for the compost, but you have to be sort of, careful with it not to add too much. So you want to add a little bit of fireplace ash at a time, and just make sure it doesn't sort of slow down the process. And you can tell if you dump in a bunch of fireplace ash, it'll kind of slow things down, but a little bit throughout the years is perfectly fine. So yeah, absolutely. So Amanda's asking about how to use the compost. So the best way to use the compost is really anywhere that you're growing something, and that could be your outdoor garden, it could be your indoor garden, it can be your lawn, it can even be used for animal bedding. So it's a pretty interesting substance, and if you're using it properly, and it can actually eliminate the need for chemical fertilizers. I personally don't use any chemical fertilizers, and my garden grows just fine. And so the way you want to use it is you want to incorporate it a little bit into the soil. So you could take a rake or a pitchfork, and just sort of mix it up and mix it around so it incorporates with the soil. Or you can just dump it around it. It's not the end of the world if it's not perfectly incorporated. Is there anything you should not use to compost? Again, things to do with cats or dogs you should avoid, because they can have certain bacteria that's not healthy. But besides that, even if something is moldy in your fridge, that's okay to compost. Some people ask about citrus and rhubarb, also okay to compost. But I would avoid things that may have non-organic things on them. So, anything that has plastic or, metal twisty ties from vegetables, things that were not at one point alive should be avoided, because they may contaminate your garden, or they just will not break down.
Grisha, we have an earlier question from Joel. How does this work when you're adding new food every day to the bin? Wouldn't that mean you never have any done bin of compost?
So the warm composting, it has sections, right? So it has these small sections with holes where once the worms are done eating, the food, they crawl to the next section above that has fresh food, and they leave the old section behind, which you can take away and use. For a compost tumbler, it's a fair question, and specifically for that question is why I put up a picture of a double-sided tumbler, so that you can get the compost going on one side, stop adding to it, let it finish, and at the same time work on the second batch on the second side of the tumbler. And I would say that's, if you had a single tumbler, that's a downside, because you can't, if you're constantly adding to it, you can add for a while because it breaks down a lot and it'll keep creating more space. But at some point, if you compost a lot, your tumbler will fill up and you'll have to wait to add to it. The 3-bin system does have an easy rotation, because you build up the first bin, you let it get full, move it to the second section, and you don't add to it until it gets to the third section and finishes. And at that point, you should have more space in the first section. So, it depends on the circumstances. If you're just by yourself and produce a little bit of compost, then maybe the worm setup is right for you. If you have a large family or a farm, then you probably want the bin system, and maybe you want 4 or 5 bins. So it's so it depends. This is an interesting question. I haven't done this one before. Sugar, absolutely. Sugar comes from a plant, and it'll compost for sure. A lot of sugar. I'd be curious what you meant, but as long as I would consider sugar as a carbon source, because it's certainly dead and it's been processed. So if you have 30 pounds of sugar, just make sure you have at least 1 pound of greens, which could be your vegetable peels or your coffee grounds. So that's that. So I hope, yeah. Is there another question?
No, I was just going to say, it looks like we don't have any more questions in chat. So if you want to move on, that's good.
Okay. Yeah, so we've covered, the science and the basics of compost. And I described a few different systems that all of us can use, at home. And then we talked about, what finished compost is and how to use it. And, I just, again, want to highlight that composting is a very good way and very easy way to sequester carbon. And by sequester, I mean get it back into the soil so that our plants can, produce and have more food. And then also at the same time, reduce these greenhouse gases. And so again, the 2 options for decomposition are either emit carbon dioxide when you do it through compost, which has 1 unit of heat, or you have decomposition in a landfill where there isn't any oxygen, which produces methane. And methane makes the earth, again, 30 times hotter than carbon dioxide, and it's very difficult to sequester. So it's hard to catch it, and it's hard to process it. So it's something everyone can do on a small scale, and they can make a very large impact. Again, only 6% of food is composted now. So if we composted more, then it would be like, it'd be like taking a bus off the road, or it'd be like, burning less oil and so forth. So it can make a big difference. And it's something that is kind of fun. It's fun to turn this, so-called waste into something that'll make your your lawn or your garden grow really, really well. Big difference between a tomato plant that doesn't have compost and a tomato plant that has a big pile of compost on it. It's amazing. So that's that. And so I grow some vegetables and I use compost. And I'm getting into the composting process on a bigger scale. So I'm really excited about it. And again, I'm really excited that so many people have interest in it. Let's see some more questions here.
Yep, we got some more.
Town collects food scraps and sends to an anaerobic digester. Any comments? The result of this process in the environment. So the anaerobic digesters definitely collect the gases, and they collect the gases on purpose, and they use the gases to power, lights or heat. And so that's an interesting process, and I think that's a good process, because you're composting, you're producing the end product, and you're also capturing the gases in an efficient way. So there's different ways to do it, but I do think anaerobic composting is a good solution, especially for urban environments where you may not have enough space to compost aerobically. David, I certainly think tomatoes taste better with compost. So that's a good question. Inadequate browns have resulted in a very wet compost, adding shredded paper. Yeah, should add some garden soil manure or something else to jumpstart. I would, if you have inadequate browns, I would add more browns, maybe a different type of brown. So if you're using shredded paper, try leaves or wood chips. I wouldn't necessarily add garden soil, but you can if you want, or you can get the compost pile closer to the ground so that existing microbes and organisms can migrate from the ground up to your compost pile. So this is our websites. If you guys have any follow-up questions after the webinar, you can send me a note, and I'd be happy to talk about gardening or composting, or farming or anything like that. And again, I'm honored that you guys have invited me for this talk, and I appreciate all of your time. And I hope that you guys, take some time to compost starting today or tomorrow.
Well, Grisha, that was great. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
And I heard that you have
thank
now
you.
been requested by other groups to give this talk after seeing our ad. So
yeah, I'm very famous now, thanks to you, Debbie.
Yes. Thank you so much. And I was just wondering if you could give us the recipe, the ratio of greens to browns, just one last time, because I didn't write it down. I
Sure,
suppose I could look it up, but I'd rather have it from you.
I would say the easy one to remember, it's a lot to a little. So you
But
want
30 to 1 is
Yeah.
Brown to green.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So
And
you want a
anything
bunch.
green is still living.
Yeah, that's right. So the brown stuff is dead,
Yeah.
and the green stuff is recently dead. But basically still kind of green and
Right.
has moisture in it. So what I like to do is I like to get a bunch of stuff, a bunch of scraps from the kitchen into a bucket, and then put the bucket right in the middle of a big pile of leaves, and then just keep mixing it up, and then you'll have some compost.
Okay, well, thanks so much.
Could I ask one last question about the ash?
Sure.
We're doing a lot of fire pits these days, so we're creating a lot of ash. When you say don't put too much in, what does that mean exactly in terms of the 30 to 1 ratio?
I think ash by itself has like a 300 to 1 ratio of carbon to nitrogen. So if you wanted to be really precise, you would just kind of get that ratio down to 30 to 1, depending on what you're adding to it. But with ash, personally, I put some in my compost, but it's so high in carbon that it can really kind of throw you off. So what I do is I just sprinkle it on the lawn, you know, like once a month or so, just lightly, and that's a good way to do it.
Okay.
So
Can you
I
sprinkle it
personally
right into the garden?
What's that?
Can you sprinkle it right into the garden?
Yeah, you
Okay.
can sprinkle it in the garden.
Okay.
But again, you want to do it kind of lightly, sort of like a dusting.
Yep. Okay.
But are food scraps considered green? Yes, certainly food scraps are green in the 30-to-1 ratio.
I have a question. We compost, but we don't produce enough compost for our size garden. And I don't want to use manure. I would like to have a vegan garden. And I was wondering if you have any suggestions for fertilizer. I've used alfalfa meal, and it kind of didn't produce, you know, I thought my production was a bit low. Is there any suggestion for fertilizer for a vegan garden?
Do you mean one that you would do yourself or one that you would purchase?
Either way at this point. I was thinking of earthworm castings because I'm okay with that, just not horse manure or any kind of manure.
Yeah, I think well, it depends on what you consider vegan.
I know.
I guess worms, you know, aren't necessarily dying in the process, but they're certainly animals. So worm castings are great. They're fairly expensive though, because, you know, it takes a lot of worms to produce compost. But if you wanted to do a vegan compost, then you would do, you know, just vegetable scraps, and then, you know, some sort of carbon source, and that would be vegan, which I think it would be really cool.
Right, that's what we do, but we just don't produce enough for our entire garden. So
yeah, that's interesting. I haven't really come across. You'd have to find, you know, a composter that doesn't use manure, which is probably, you know, one of the more common ingredients.
Right.
And you know, either manure or like, you know, lobster shells or whatever people use. But yeah, I'd be interested in maybe doing separate batches of compost that are vegan for people like yourself. I think that's a good.
Yeah, because people do put meat in their compost, I guess, you know.
Yeah,
so.
They certainly can. You know, composting, if you look at the you know, big, you know, pig farms or cow farms, you know, what they'll do is, you know, when animals die, and sometimes they die without going to the slaughterhouse, you have to get rid of them. And what people do is they make a big pile of wood chips, and they'll put like a whole animal inside of a big pile of carbon, like, you know, wood chips or leaves. And then after like a month or two, it'll be all broken down, and it'll be just the bones that they take out. And that's how a lot of farms will handle mortalities in a kind of a sustainable way.
Thank you so much. This has been great.
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
Yes. Thanks again. And if you look at this last slide, it has Grisha's website, and it has the Upper Charles Climate Action, which is your local sustainability group, our website address as well. And we'd love to hear from you guys. And we meet the last Monday of every month. So we'd love to have you join us. Thank you, everybody.